So by now we've constructed a rhombus as well as a rectangle, so now we're ready to move on to the square. And if you remember this from class, all I ever say is tell you that a square is when a parallelogram is a rhombus and a rectangle. So if I can draw a figure that is both a rhombus and a rectangle, then I've shown that it's a square. And which means that I need 4 congruent sides as well as 4 right angles. And instead of trying to construct a square off of those rigid definitions, I'm going to go off the easier parts of their definitions. Namely, for a rectangle, I have congruent diagonals. And for a rhombus, I have perpendicular diagonals. And that might not seem like a lot, but it's enough for me to make a square. So right now, I need to make a pair of diagonals that are both perpendicular and congruent. So what I am going to do is first make myself a segment. And first thing I'm going to make sure of is to make sure I draw a line that's a diagonal that's perpendicular to this, and I can edit the length later on. So I'm going to draw a perpendicular bisector through this segment first. And then I'm going to draw a perpendicular bisector that is once again way too long. And if you remember the construction for the rhombus, I did not need this segment of this diagonal and this segment of this diagonal to be congruent, because that's not one of the rules of a rhombus. But for a rectangle, we know that the diagonals have to be congruent to each other. So what I have to make sure is that whatever I cut off from this long diagonal I drew is congruent to the diagonal that I've already drawn. So what I'm going to do is measure the distance using the slider from the midpoint of my original diagonal to one of its endpoints. Make sure I get it just right. And then I'm going to mark that on my perpendicular bisector, which is going to be here at this point and here at this point. And now that I know my diagonals are both perpendicular, and because each half of the diagonals are congruent to every other half, I know that my diagonals are also congruent. And this gives me an opportunity to connect those dots. And know that I've constructed myself the perfect square.